Hi everyone, I am doing a video today to hopefully clarify and answer questions related to the final case formulation examination, and hopefully this will give you more clarity on how to address some aspects of the exam as I have it right in front of me. We're going to go ahead and review important aspects. Of course, if you have additional questions or concerns, you can always write me an email after watching this video. So first of all, the premise of this exam is that I want you to be able to read a case study, come up with a diagnosis, provide a justification or a formulation or a rationale for selecting a diagnosis, and then hopefully decide on which interventions based on the literature might be appropriate for the diagnosis you selected. So that is the overall kind of aim of this examination. There are two books that well, one of them you really need them to be able to answer the exam, and the other one is more of a reference book to help you formulate your case formulation. So you will need DSM-5 in order to be able to provide the diagnosis, and then to elaborate your diagnostic formulation, because you need to talk about criteria that the client needs for that diagnosis that you're giving him or her. You are going to also be using the DSM-5. And then in terms of elaborating your case formulations, you might want to use the textbooks of Galanter and Jensen, which you have already used throughout the semester, kind of like to give you an example of how to write a case formulation. In addition, I already posted since the beginning of the course within course materials in the file folder that says I think here case formulation examples. You're gonna find two exam examples of students that performed really well, and it should also give you a very good idea of how to conduct a case formulation. The questions are basically the same. What varies is the case study that I used, obviously, but it gives you a really good idea of how a student that did really well write up their narratives for the exam. The exam will be submitted via Blackboard. I think it's easier for me to have them all in Blackboard instead of having students send them directly to my email. If, however, you do encounter any issues, do not risk submitting late. Just go ahead and send it by email. For those of you that can do it without any problem via Blackboard, please submit it on Blackboard. The exam has been available since the beginning of class, so I know you've had ample time to work on it, hopefully. And having that in mind, it's going to be due, as the instruction states, on May 6th by the close of that day at 5 p.m. Unfortunately, because graduation is so quickly approaching and I have so many of you in the course, I will not be able to accept exams later than that date. If for some reason, because health issues happen, family issues happen, then you and I would need to talk, probably to devise a plan, and most likely I'll just give you an incomplete and then give you the opportunity to submit your exam during the summertime or early on in the spring. So do not panic if anything were to happen, which can happen in anyone's life. There are always alternatives that we can come up with, and I have had students in the past that have gotten incompletes, and I'm very punctual in kind of revising them in their due dates and giving you a grade as early as possible. But hopefully none of that will happen to any of you. The diagnostic formulation, or the entire exam, should be approximately 6 to 8 pages. I kind of give a little bit of a range for those of you that write too little and those of you that write too much. If you write 6 and you're very thorough, that is right. There's no issue with that, but just so you know, for those of you that might want to write a little bit more, 8 pages is the maximum number of pages that you're going to be allotted to write. And this is, of course, not counting the reference page and the title page. As far as references go, there is a minimum of 4, and this is only applicable to the question about intervention, as we will see shortly. That is the only question that you're going to be using references, so I ask for a minimum of 4. You don't need any more than that. And just as a side note, the Galanter and Jensen book and the DSM-5 will not count as references because those are textbooks that we use regularly for the course. And the idea is that I want you to do a little bit of literature review and see what's out there in terms of interventions. And for this exam, contrary to the discussion board posts and video analyses, I'm a little bit harsher with APA guidelines, as well as grammar and punctuation and other linguistic rules. So I would highly encourage you to kind of read it carefully before you submit it. It is absolutely fine if you make 1 or 2 typos or like just few errors. That's human. But I'm just talking about papers in generally that are very flawed in terms of their writing and their structure. So there are a couple of resources in our school for writing, and then you also have friends or other colleagues that might be able to provide feedback on your writing if writing is a concerning issue for you. Now, moving on to the exam, we have kind of like the main questions, and then I'm going to break them and explain each of them to you. Many students ask me, can I write, do I have to write my answer next to each question? Do I need to write, can I write it in narrative format, or how should I write this exam? No, you do not need to write the answers right below each question. You can write it as one entire, careful with this. You can write it in a narrative format, but just be mindful to maybe give me a little kind of heading. For example, if you're talking about risk factors, if you're talking about in the intervention, if you're talking about the diagnosis, just give me headings so that I know what you're referring to. Some students have also asked me, for example, professor, can I use bullet points when I write the risk factors and protective factors? Absolutely, you can. Make sure that you are you explicate yourself well, even if you're writing in bullet points. Just make sure that you answer the question correctly. I've had students that use bullet points for some components of the exam, and they are very thorough in their answers. So you can use bullet points to organize yourself as long as you're answering what's being asked of you. Now, going into specific aspects of the exam, let's start with the first part, which is what we're going to do first is we're going to write the diagnosis and the diagnostic formulation, and then we're going to answer the following, I think there are 7 questions that are included. So how am I going to elaborate my diagnosis and diagnostic formulation? You're first going to choose a diagnosis, and then you're going to base that off the DSM-5. You don't need to make that up, or you don't need to reinvent the wheel. If you, for example, selected major depressive disorder or social anxiety disorder, you're going to use the same code, the same number, and the same label for the diagnosis. And then if your client in the case study, you think he or she meets additional criteria in terms of specifiers, for example, well, professor, I think in the case study, this kid has major depressive disorder and I think it's a single episode or it's recurrent or it's with psychotic symptoms, you want to put those two in the diagnosis. I'm a little bit lenient with the kind of subcategories within a diagnosis. You don't have to get them all right. Um, some students, they just maybe highlight one or two specifiers or this subcategories to diagnosis, which is absolutely fine. You don't need to incorporate everything. My recommendation for you is always stick with simplicity, right? um, if you're not sure about your response, then when I read it I won't be sure. So when you answer, make sure that everything you write, it's clearly stated, is simple but concise and clear, right? Sometimes students include a lot of terminology, but they don't do a good job at explaining it, and I have no way of knowing if the student really know what they're talking about. So if you're clear and simple, um, it's better, because what you don't necessarily, if you maybe missed something, but the rest is really well explained, you will maximize your chances of doing better. Versus if you start putting a lot of things, you don't explain any of those things, and then I start feeling confused. So it's not a good situation for you. So that goes to say, the reason why I bring this up is also because you can have more than one diagnosis, right? Sometimes, as you have learned, diagnoses can coexist. You may be able to have, for example, ADHD and a conduct disorder, right? Or ADHD and social anxiety. How do I know this? Because you guys know that in DSM-5, within each of the diagnoses, there is a section on differential diagnosis or comorbidities, and it kind of gives you a little blurb or paragraph or what are some of the other diagnoses that can coexist with that diagnosis or the ones that flat out cannot coexist. It is absolutely okay, as you can see in the examples from previous exams, that some students are very adventurous and they kind of include two diagnoses if it's applicable. Um, you don't really have to include two diagnoses as long as you're clear with one diagnosis. That is absolutely fine. I rather you be clear with one diagnosis than you start writing a bunch of diagnoses and not explaining them well. So the key here is keep it simple and explain it well. So that is as far as goes for diagnosis and diagnostic